You know that feeling, right? You create this amazing design on your screen. It looks perfect, but then you try to turn it into a real world thing like a t-shirt or a hat, and it just falls flat. Well, today, we're going to bridge that gap. We're diving into how you take your digital art from a bunch of pixels to a polished professional product. We have all been there. You've got this small logo, it looks super sharp. But then you try to blow it up for a banner or maybe even just a bigger print, and suddenly, boom, it's a fuzzy, pixelated mess. It is probably one of the most common frustrations for creators, and it all comes down to the kind of file you're starting with. So, to get to the bottom of this, we've got to understand a really fundamental concept. Not all digital images are created equal. Nope. They basically fall into two main categories. And knowing the difference, that's the first and honestly the most important step to make sure your art translates perfectly into the real world. Okay, first up we have raster images. The best way to think about these is like a digital mosaic, or maybe like a piece of graph paper where every single tiny square or pixel is filled with a specific color. This is how your photos work, and most of the images you'll find online. But here's the catch. The number of pixels is totally fixed. So when you try to make the image bigger, you're not adding detail. You're just stretching out those same squares. And that is what causes all that blurriness. But then, on the other hand, we have vector images. Now, instead of a grid of pixels, a vector is way more like a digital blueprint. It's built using math, equations that define all the points, lines, and curves in your design. And because it's based on this mathematical blueprint and not a set number of squares, you can scale a vector image up to the size of a building, and it will stay perfectly crisp and clear every single time. And wow, this slide just shows it perfectly, doesn't it? On the left, you can see that raster image just falling apart into those jagged little pixels as you zoom in. But on the right, the vector image, it stays completely smooth. It's really the difference between a static mosaic that's set in stone and a dynamic blueprint that can be resized infinitely. So what's the big deal? Why does this matter so much? Because when you're making something physical, especially something with tiny details like embroidery, having that clean, perfect blueprint is absolutely everything. Let's look at how this really plays out in the real world. This quote really just says it all. That clarity and that scalability, they aren't just about looking good on a screen. They directly translate into the quality of whatever you're making. For an embroidery machine, a vector file gives it a super clean, precise path for the needles to follow. It makes sure every single stitch lands exactly where it's supposed to. Now, is it an absolute must-have every time? Not necessarily. But for any design that's got complex details, sharp lines, or text, starting with vector art is pretty much the professional standard. It's the difference between a design that looks crisp and clean and one that looks kinda muddy. You're basically giving the whole process the best possible ingredients to start with. Okay, so you've got your beautiful, clean vector art. How does that digital blueprint actually become a stitched design on a hat or a jacket? This is where this really cool process called digitizing comes in. Think of it as the magic bridge between your art file and the physical embroidery machine. To put it simply, embroidery digitizing is basically an act of translation. It's taking your artwork, and yeah, ideally that clean vector file, and turning it into a set of instructions that tells the embroidery machine exactly what to do, where to put the needle, what kind of stitch it should use, and even when to change the color of the thread. And this breaks it down so well. You start with that clean artwork, right? Then, a person called a digitizer maps out all the paths the stitches are going to follow. It's almost like they're tracing your design with thread. Then, they assign specific stitch types, like a smooth satin stitch for borders or a fill stitch for bigger areas. And finally, they export a special file that the embroidery machine can actually read. Now, I know what you might be thinking. This all sounds really complex and probably super expensive. But here's the great part. You do not need to break the bank to get started with this. There are some incredibly powerful and get this completely free tools out there that can help you dive right into the world of digitizing your own designs. And yeah, you might be surprised at just how accessible this all is. There are at least 5 fantastic, totally free software options out there that can put this power right in your hands. This means you can take control of the entire process yourself. So let's take a quick look. You've got these amazing open source options like Inkscape, which gets its digitizing superpowers from a free add-on called Ink Stitch. And then you have other dedicated tools like My Editor, SewArt, and Embroider. Each one has slightly different features, but they all help you convert your images and map out those all-important stitches. They're all amazing resources, and they're definitely worth exploring.
Okay, so this core idea that a clean blueprint is everything, it doesn't just stop at embroidery. Not at all. This logic is pretty much universal. It applies almost any time you're taking something from the digital world and trying to make it physical, like, say, creating high-quality art prints.
And this right here is the main point. Whether you're working with thread or ink or really any other medium, the quality you put in is the quality you get out. It's that simple. A low-res raster image is always going to give you a fuzzy print. A clean, high-resolution source file is the absolute foundation for a crisp, professional product. Let's look at another example from the art world, just to drive this home. Let's compare a standard digital print to something called a serigraph, which you might know as a silkscreen print. You'll see that, just like the difference between a raster and a vector file, the process here fundamentally changes the outcome, the quality, and even the value of the final piece. See, a serigraph is a very hands-on, labor-intensive process. It uses separate screens for each individual color to build up these really rich, layered textures. This takes a ton of skill and artist involvement, kind of like creating a really clean vector file and then a precise digitizing plan. And just like our embroidery example, that extra care and effort in the creation process leads to a higher quality and often a more valuable final product. So, what's the one thing you should take away from all of this? From pixels to stitches, from digital files to fine art prints, the rule is always the same. If you want a professional, top-notch physical product, you have to start with a professional, high-quality digital source. Garbage in, garbage out. Quality in, quality out. So now you have the blueprint for success. You get the difference between pixels and paths, and you know the secret is to create a design that's as clean and as scalable as your idea itself. So the only question left is, what amazing thing are you going to create?